You're listening to Foreseeable, a production of Global is Asian, the flagship digital platform of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Each episode, we invite an expert for a conversation relating to their field of study or experience and to find out what they foresee happening in the future. Francesco Mancini, Vice Dean, Executive Education, and Associate Professor in Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, has an extensive background in the prevention and settlement of armed conflict. He was a senior director at the International Peace Institute in New York, a think tank that works very closely with the United Nations and its member states. He has been working in and around conflict, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and negotiation for close to 20 years. In that light, we've asked him to share his views on the current military conflict in Ukraine.
Sometimes I feel that, looking at conflicts, it's hard to see something new. But I would say that this conflict in Ukraine is really a different level of conflict.
Can you expand on that more? What things really strike you as something that's different and difficult compared to what you've seen over the past 20 years?
Yeah, obviously, one of the key factors is that this is a conflict that happens in the heart of Europe. It involves one of the major powers in the world and has reverberations that are global. In the past 20 years, we actually experienced many conflicts. I mean, obviously, the Iraq war and Afghanistan were very much in the news. But there were conflicts in Syria, there were conflicts in Libya, there were conflicts in Africa, in West and East Africa, in Yemen, you name it, right? But none of this conflict has raised the same level of warring around the world as the conflict in Ukraine. And I think it's because it has brought back images of sort of a traditional war that we haven't seen in Europe since the end of World War II. It has created, obviously, a huge flow of refugees and a huge human disaster. And it's deeply involving the major powers of our times. So that's why everybody is focusing on it.
Mm-hmm. And now it's been dragging on for almost 2 months. What do you see as far as a possible end?
Yeah, it's very hard. And I would say even probably a bit foolish to make prediction about these things. So on one hand, you can say that we might know what the end game should be, right? We would like to see at the end. But the challenge is to get there. And I think we should think about solutions in steps, not as a one goal. The most urgent aspect is obviously the humanitarian aspect, to limit the human suffering on the ground as much as possible. And so to me, that's why peace negotiations are still important, even if they're not producing a peace agreement, right? Focusing on, humanitarian corridors, ceasefires, and everything that can be done, even if very hard to achieve on the ground. More on the long term, I think the challenge is politically how you identify that kind of end game. On one hand, respect international law and give back to Ukraine its sovereignty. But on the other hand, also taking in consideration Russia's security concerns. And I think that is the real challenge here.
And you mentioned negotiations and the urgency for humanitarian needs to be considered first, but so far that hasn't happened. I mean, the attempts at humanitarian corridors have not been honored. It's still been difficult. There's been so many civilians targeted, and there has not been any attempts at a ceasefire that have gone very far. So how is this going to improve at all? Or is it just going to have a military solution or a clear military victor?
So I would say that, first of all, again, for people who have been observing conflict in the past, this is not a new challenge, but it's not a reason for not attempting negotiation. If you think about Syria, another conflict that raised quite a bit of attention in the past. In Syria, there were constant negotiations in Geneva between the parties, but very often the ceasefire that were agreed in Geneva, they were actually never implemented on the ground because there are obviously challenges on the ground. Some are even just logistical challenges. In some cases, there is no real willingness on the other side to implement these ceasefires or respect some agreements related to humanitarian relief. Again, no reason for not continuing to do that. And I think that at the margin, some of these things are actually, happening, but not to the scale that, we will want. When it comes to, you mentioned the Victor piece, I think this is the real political challenge here. Because I think, all sitting here, we would like to see sovereignty and order be restored and the integrity of the Ukrainian state. But I think we're also politically very concerned of what Putin would do with his back against the wall, if you imagine some kind of victory from the Ukrainian side. And so there are, some political issues which are related to the security concerns and of Russia and how those can be addressed, respecting, obviously, the sovereignty and the decisions of other countries. I think that is the key challenge. And as of now, I don't think we can still envision what that actual compromise and solution would be. And in fact, a lot of experts say that the most likely scenario for now is some sort of fighting continuing, probably focusing more in the east of the Ukrainian, as what we're seeing in these days. Maybe some escalations of violence, but overall some kind of low intensity violence continuing there. And I think this is also important to remember, that the invasion of Ukraine didn't start 2 months ago, but actually started in 2014. So this conflict has been going on for a very, very long time. Ukraine was already a country at war, and this escalation has obviously made things, worse and more complicated. But you could imagine some kind of scenario going down the road in which there is more low-intensity conflict lingering for quite a bit of time.
If that is, in fact, what happens, and as one scenario, the high-level, high-intensity conflict, many people have suggested that this is just a sign that the international system does not work, that the UN, which is supposedly set up to prevent situations like this and has Russia as a permanent member of the Security Council, people are asking, what is the point of the international system? What's your opinion about that? And how do you see the international system coping with this?
Yes. Listen, I think this is actually a major challenge for the UN, and more generally speaking, for our sort of global system. After all, the UN has been set up to saving succeeding generation from the scourge of war. However, it has limits. And I think this is a perfect example of where this limit stands. And the limit stands particularly when one of the permanent members of the Security Council, so one of those 5 countries that have a veto power, are actually involved in the conflict. That's the challenge. I would still have a sort of more positive outlook in terms of the UN reaction, because given these limitations, I think the UN reacted with a very strong condemnation through the General Assembly. Now, obviously, resolutions in the General Assemblies don't really have teeth because they're non-binding, right? There's no real enforcement. So I obviously agree that is, hard to implement whatever is decided in the General Assembly. But with that said, when you have a resolution that condemned this invasion, supported by 141 countries out of 193, to me is a very strong sign. And, only just a bunch of countries actually voted against it. Many others just abstained. So I think the signal to the global governance systems are quite clear, are quite strong. Also, the sanction system that has been put in place, possibly one of the strongest sanctions system ever devised, has collected quite a bit of support. There are obviously challenges and of what are the rules, of the sanction system and how you decide to do certain things. So the system is not perfect at the global level. But I would also not agree with those who think that this is a sign of the demise of the United Nations. I would even argue that for the big powers to have a veto is a bit of a guarantee that they will not leave. I don't want to go back in history too much, but there was a precursor of the United Nations, which was the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was a body that was very much based on consensus. basically every country had a vote. And, as history teaches us, what happened when war began. All the countries that started to invade other countries just simply left the League of Nations. Germany, left in 1933, Japan also in 1933, Italy in 1937. And, and that was the end of the League, basically, right? So what we actually want in a system is that actually countries still stay engaged. Obviously, some countries will fight for their own national interest, but I think it's important that the organization is still there and manages to keep this conversation going.
In light of that, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, that politically there does need to be a solution that restores sovereignty to Ukraine, but also recognizes Russia's legitimate security concerns. That seems to be where the UN would play a part. But then we see things like Finland and other Scandinavian countries that were non-aligned now wanting to join NATO. Are they making things worse for themselves? Is that outcome becoming less possible because of this conflict?
Yes, I didn't necessarily say that these are legitimate or not legitimate security concerns. In our field, we have something that we call threat perception, which is actually something that dictates very much, how countries react to security concern. And threat perception, changes depending on where you sit and also depend when you sit. So threat perception changes over time and over space. And that is something that really shape a country's reaction, right, to security issues. And I think, for example, one of the reasons a lot of Asian countries condemn this invasion is because, the scenario of a country start to invade other countries is not something that anybody wants to see, right? So threat perception is very important. There is obviously a threat perception of a certain kind in Russia, but we also have to recognize that there is a threat perception coming from countries sitting very close to Russia. And so obviously they are reacting to that threat perception, thinking about what their alternatives are. And we have to remember that the NATO enlargement of the 90s was also a NATO enlargement due to the fact that a lot of Eastern European countries really wanted to join NATO. They really wanted, after decades of being occupied and being part of the Soviet Empire, they wanted to have a sort of a different options, right, out there. And we can discuss how wise could have been from the Western point of view. But I go back to my key point of the threat perception. East European countries have their own threat perception, right, as well. So they have their own concern. And that's one of the reasons why some countries want, for example, going toward NATO. And maybe they might feel that neutrality is not a guarantee any longer.
And could you describe just what other impacts this war has had more generally at the global level?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, you have all these geopolitical issues that we were discussing, right? And I think there is obviously this broader conversation happening right now about the sort of global security architecture. At the Boao Forum for Asia, Chinese President Xi Jinping has talked about the idea of the principle of the indivisible security, which is something that we're seeing coming out of Russia and China in these days. It's actually a very interesting concept because indivisible security is actually a very European concept that came out of the 1970s. It was actually included in the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, which basically set sort of ground rules for the interaction between two blocks. And in that particular case, NATO, on the Western Alliance, and the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union and its satellite states. So when you call for a principle like indivisible security, you obviously have in mind a very sort of block-defined world in which you have two sides, satellite states around these two sides, and none of them should move, right? Should make any move, because any move would create a security concern on the other side. And actually, we call this a security dilemma, because when you try to protect yourself, right, you might create a threat on the other side. This idea of the world divided in blocks, it's, I think, a very outdated view of the world. And it's also a view that not all countries in the world might accept, particularly small countries, which might not see themselves as simply a kind of satellite of some kind of block, right? But actually countries that have full agency or making decisions. They might make wrong decisions, right? But yeah, we're not talking about right and wrong. We're again talking about, full agencies of countries in their own security matters. So I think, you see, there's a huge debate now here that is opening up, and obviously it doesn't have, easy solutions. There are obviously economic impacts. I think, you can read a lot about sanctions. Obviously, as I said, it's a very strong regime, sanction regime. And so I think that has big implication. Some of this has also built on current economic trends that are not very positive, like inflation or energy cost, food cost, and things like that. So definitely there are some of these implications as well. Obviously, there are supply chain concerns. I would say one final from someone who's been, kind of looking at conflict for many years. I would say there is also an issue of accountability. And I'm particularly referring to atrocities committed in war. Once again, atrocity in wars are nothing new. Today, we have technology that allowed us to see these things in a much clearer way. But as you can imagine right now, obviously, there are rising voices of keeping Russia, for example, accountable for certain crimes and atrocities that are committed in Ukraine. How these will work into that kind of peace that we were discussing before, it's a huge question, right? But there is an issue of accountability because there is the law of going to war, but there is also the law of what you do in war. So it's not a free-for-all. And so this issue of accountability, I think, is also very important, particularly when it comes to a big power. And I think that's also something that has an impact on the overall conversation around peace and conflict solution.
I know that some other nations have been trying to assist as far as documenting atrocities and referring things to the International Criminal Court. Is that correct? And other
Correct.
efforts. But is that enough? Will that lead to some accountability, or are you worried that it might fall through or not happen?
Well, I am obviously very concerned that these will never go through, and it's incredibly complex. It's not as straightforward as you can imagine, right? So obviously, the International Criminal Court is investigating possible war crimes in Ukraine, but there is no guarantee that would, really go anywhere, because international criminal law has its own limits. And so there are, first of all, it's limited to certain specific crimes like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crime of aggression. Also, it affects the country that sign up to the court, because both Russia and Ukraine, they actually signed the statute, but they did not ratify it. So it's a bit of a complicated issue also from the legal point of view. But I think primarily it's a political problem. And the political problem is that, everything we learn about conflict is that in the long term, if you want a sustainable peace, you need also to address issue of responsibilities. Many countries have done that, disparate countries, from Cambodia to Argentina, just to mention two. In the long term, you need to address these issues. And this, I think, it's a huge challenge in this particular conflict.
Can I bring the conversation to Asia in a way and ask you to kind of describe what was the reaction to this war in ASEAN, in the ASEAN nations?
Yes, absolutely. I think, first of all, I think one mistake would be to think that, Southeast Asia is far from Ukraine and so shouldn't really interest us here in this part of the world, but in reality, it does have an impact. And I think what I was saying before about threat perception is also very important here, particularly in a part of the world in which there is a history of interference and country, stepping into the borders of other countries. And I think this history has led to having Southeast Asian countries supporting in a large number the General Assembly resolution that condemned Russian invasion. 8 out of 10 ASEAN states supported the resolution, and 2 were actually sponsor promoting. One is Singapore, and the other is Cambodia, which might actually surprise. But Cambodia has also history, right? That has an impact on maybe on this decision. The 2 countries that abstained were Vietnam and Laos. I think there are some obviously relationship that also with Russia, particularly in terms of strategic partnership. Actually, Vietnam is one of the 3 comprehensive strategic partners of Russia with India and China, and has a heavy dependence on Russian weaponry. So, that might be one of the reasons. Interestingly enough, Myanmar has supported the resolution. However, the current ambassador in the UN is not representing the military government of Myanmar. So there's a bit of an outlier here, that Myanmar actually, the military government has supported Russia, but not in this particular case in the UN. But with that said, obviously, particularly for countries like Singapore, but many others in the region, such the violation of international law is a huge red flag. And the principle of international law is fundamental and has to be respected in this case. And I think that's what has driven the Singapore position. Singapore is not pro-Ukraine or anti-Russia or anything. Is pro-principle of international law. And so this is an absolutely existential threat, such a violation. Obviously, other impacts, economic impacts, I mentioned before. All this is going to make things more complicated when it comes to inflation, for example, increasing food prices and oil spike. Sanction, I think there are limited disruption in this part of the world. There is not such a dependence on Russian economy in this part of the world. Maybe there is a question on the sort of secondary impact related on China, for example. If indirectly, you're dealing with a country that is violating the sanction. But I still feel that the sanction impact is not so huge in this part of the world. And it is primarily an issue of, as I said, of international law and obviously some economic impact.
You said you cannot predict, and no one would want to predict, but it definitely seems like this could go on much longer. Are there any international players that have any kind of influence that could make a difference?
I do agree with you that the current situation is something that unfortunately will probably continue for a while. And obviously it's hard to predict in terms of level of violence, but it is kind of a safe assumption to assume that, the current kind of scenario of fighting in the east of the country will continue, and maybe having, days where violence escalate, but overall have a more lower intensity conflict. All the scenarios that I've been reading about of sort of regime change, both in Ukraine as in Russia, I think there are a complete outlier, and I don't see that to be really likely. Who can do something? Well, and we've seen different attempts, right, coming from many different directions, including Israel, for example, or maybe Turkey, or very interestingly, I think China would have potentially an interesting role to play as a mediator. Maybe not a role that they want to play, but in terms of, if I think of peace as a global public good, I can see a country like China that could contribute to that, and could help to bridge that gap. Because obviously Western countries are not, positioned in this case very well, as they've been heavily sided with Ukraine. But you can also think in the past there's also been kind of a multilateral setting with multiple mediators, not just one, where everybody plays kind of a slightly kind of guarantor role. So you could also think of such a configuration in which you have, a group of Western countries, maybe countries that they don't have such a vested role, maybe they're not NATO members, but they can still play a facilitation role, and, China. But again, as of today, nobody has been really able to edge there, but primarily because I think that the political stars are not aligned. Again, no excuse for not doing negotiation. But again, it's quite normal to have both war on the ground and talk. Most war have this happening at the same time. So it's still war continuing, and the scenarios on the ground will shape the conversation on the table as well. So there is an interaction between these two. So I think it's still a bit early to identify a clear way out, or what we might, think of what this final solution could be for us. It will still take, many steps before we get there.
Before we go, I can't let you go without asking about the information war that's going on and the misinformation and the way that all this is playing out on social media and how it's affecting the political reality of what's going on.
Yes. Yes, this is obviously, a big part of the war conversation. Let me just say, first of all, that, propaganda is not something new in war. Countries fight over information, have fought over information, the control of information. And during any war, countries try to shape the narrative of that war. What is very new here is that we have new tools to do that, which are new tools that reach us straight into our living room, live. So there is basically no gap between what's happened and what you see. This is obviously new. And it creates all new dynamics that are obviously very, very hard to control. Countries are trying to shape the narratives with real news as well as the fake ones. I think there are organizations that are doing a lot of work to try to help us to understand what is real, what is not. Unfortunately, some of these technologies are getting so good that it's getting harder and harder. Some are blatantly false, and it's kind of quite easy to find out. But it always requires a bit of proactive role from our side as an audience. And so I think that the main challenge here is that we need to educate us as recipient of information to do that little extra step to check. Because in some cases, the checking is very easy. And you can immediately find out that, for example, some of the footages, some of the images are coming from completely unrelated issues. The source of the news, for example, just go to check where is it coming from. Overall, I think that the main principle is don't just buy whatever gets into your phone, but do that little extra mile, that do the little bit of extra work to check.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your insight. I wish there was something more optimistic to end on, but it doesn't seem that way. We'll just have to wait and see and hope that, like you said, that people still work towards a peaceful resolution, even if it seems perhaps impossible or the challenges are too great.
I agree with you. It's obviously very hard to be positive on such a topic or optimistic. However, in any dire situation like this one, particularly when there is physical violence involved, there is always a light. And I think we have seen the way that the Ukrainian people has reacted to this situation. We also have seen many Russian people, how they reacted, against this. And we've seen an international community, let's call it this way, so a global community of people getting together on the refugees issue, as well as kind of making points on international law. So it's not all dark here. There are people who are working very hard to find a solution to that. What obviously is dark is the ground, is the suffering of the people on the ground, which is always the first concern when you're trying to address a conflict. That's your primary concern, is to minimize that human suffering, is to find political solutions that can hold, that would save life and make life of people targeted by violence less miserable and less dangerous. So that's my kind of optimistic angle, if I can. I do realize that it's in these days it's very hard. Is that we're not going to give up. There are people working on peace. There are people working on solutions that might eventually bring peace back. But it is a very dark road to walk on until better days. But again, I would leave that option open. I wouldn't be completely pessimistic.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And on that, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to subscribe to the Global is Asian newsletter, look for the link in the description or find us on Facebook at Global is Asian.